now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to our story-ended segment where we talk to some of the world's great authors about their works. The Book Thief was first released in 2005, and it spent 375 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. In 2013, an adaptation of the book starring Geoffrey Rush packed theaters. The Book Thief continues to move young and older readers. Now, a special edition has been released, an anniversary edition. I recently sat down with the author, Markus Zusak, to discuss his life and career, what stories he's currently working on, and those that have shaped and influenced his work. Markus, let's start with what compelled you to write this story 10 years ago. Where did it come from?
It just came from my childhood, really, growing up hearing the stories of my mum and dad. They grew up in Germany and Austria during and after the Second World War. And they just told us these amazing stories that were, devastating and beautiful and sometimes funny, because they just told us about their childhoods and they were great storytellers. So I grew up hearing about cities that were burning while the ground was covered in ice. I heard about kids who gave bread to Jewish people and other so-called criminals, on their way to concentration camps, and just kids doing quite amazing things. And I thought, I'm going to write a 100-page novella about that, and it turned into a 500-page book that meant everything to me. So now, I've been lucky.
And tell me, when I first read this book, it had to be 8 or 9 years ago, probably 10 years ago when it first came out. I've always thought this is about a little girl, Liesl, who is really, she's preserving a piece of the world. She's preserving the best part of the world through words, through these books and pages that she's able to preserve. Give people a sense of where that character came from, and what does it mean to you all these years later, reading this story, reading Liesl's story?
Yeah, well, Liesl just was a natural piece of my imagination. And when I talk about writing the book from my parents' stories, it was like scratching something open in your mind, reaching in and pulling that world out, or waking up one day and realizing you can speak another language.
Yeah,
that's what it was like, and that was my first research. And all these years later, when I think about what the book is about, I think about there was a world where Hitler destroyed people with words and propaganda, and here was a girl who's stealing the words back, and she's writing her own story through the story of Nazi Germany, and hopefully it's a beautiful story written amongst that ugly world.
There is something powerful, I think, in the telling and novel. Death is the narrator of this book, and I know you wrestled back and forth. You tried it in the voice of Death, then you tried it in Liesl's voice, then you tried it third person, and you went back to Death as the narrator. Why?
Well, I think people think that writers have great imaginations, and it's a sort of whimsical idea of these, you get bursts of inspiration, but we don't have great imaginations, we just have a lot of problems.
A stumble in the darkness?
Yeah, that's right.
Shh, don't tell them. You're ruining the whole mystique.
Exactly, I know. It's that idea, though, that necessity is the mother of invention. And the problem I had with Death was originally he was too dark and macabre, too typical of Death.
Yeah.
And then I went to Liesl. My new problem, despite my German and Austrian background, was I now had the most Australian-sounding German girl in the history of books. And so I arrived back at Death when I thought, what if it was just a little to the left or right of what I was doing before? And he's actually afraid of humans. He's actually afraid for us. And he's always finding humans at our worst. So he's going to try to write a story or tell a story about humans being beautiful and worthwhile and selfless, and that's why he's telling Liesl's story.
No, it's compelling, and of course the friendships, the foster parents that she finds in the course of this story, who really teach her to read and foster this impulse she already has.
Yeah, I'm really impressed. You've really read the book.
What do you think? I'm lying to you? Yes, I've read the book.
No, I know that. But, sometimes you can tell when someone's saying, well, what's your book about?
What's the book about? Tell us about Death. This is set in Germany.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you have any hesitation, because there's been so much written about the Holocaust, any hesitation about writing in that genre, in that world?
I think I was still a kid when I started writing it, in writing terms. I mean, I think I was 26 or 27 when I started writing the book, and And I didn't think of it that way.
You didn't realize the implications it could have or not.
Yeah, it was the old adage of being a writer that the first thing you do is you write what you know. Yeah, even if you're writing a science fiction novel, you're still writing about yourself. And so I just wrote about the stories I knew. If my parents were Portuguese or Mexican or whatever, that I would have been telling those stories. And so I never put it into a category ever, and that's how it became the book it did.
The Book Thief was released as an adult book in Australia.
Yeah.
In the United States, it was released as a YA, a young adult book.
Yeah.
Did that shift at all the perception of this work, and did it change at all the way you saw it afterward, when it became such a worldwide hit?
Well, I thought this would be my least successful book. I thought it would sink without a trace because, you know, I imagine someone trying to recommend it to their friend and the friend says, well, what's it about? You know, and you say, well, it's set in Nazi Germany, it's narrated by death, nearly everyone dies, you know, and it's 500 pages long, you'll love it.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I honestly, you know, and not to be too glib about that, but I just didn't even think of it as a book for adults or kids, and because I didn't think it would be successful. And I think once you let go of that, and you let go of the idea of audience, and you would know yourself being a writer that suddenly you're free. And I know with that book, I see faults in it and all sorts of problems, but I know that it couldn't be accused of being unambitious or that it didn't have any ideas in it. And so I forgot about audience, and that's what made it the book it became.
Yeah, and it's also a book I read in an interview you gave once, and you said you should write the book that scares you, the book that you're not sure you can finish.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard all sorts of writers speak over the years, and you have very professional writers who do say things like, well, I'm a professional, not an amateur. I only start books I know I can finish.
Right.
And I sort of think, oh, I'm happy to be an amateur because it's the idea that I always want to write above myself, and I want to start books that I'm not sure I can finish because then you're in your discomfort zone and you know how that gets the best out of you. So that's what I'm hoping for each time.
Well, this is our story-oriented segment, which is a literary segment we do once a month on the show. We have a few emails, and a little girl wrote in. Her name is Susan, and she asked, how did you get into the mind of a little girl to tell Liesel's story? She found that odd, that it was a man writing Liesel's story.
Yeah, well, I can say to Susan, it was just a natural progression because it was so vividly put to me by my mum growing up in that time. I could see it all, and I never thought of a boy being the main character. It was always Liesl, and she was sort of a tomboy in a lot of ways, and she was a tough kid and really resilient, and so it was very close to my heart, so it just came naturally.
Did you have problems finding her voice? I mean, when the entire book was going to be in her voice?
I did, and maybe that was also one of the things that steered me back to death. It's as another writer friend of mine said to me, you just do what you can get away with. And
now that's a great line.
It is.
And true.
And so maybe I got to Liesel's voice through the guise of death. And you know, when it's death, you can almost all bets are off.
Do you write background? I do these long folders, and I'll do background and biography. And how do you do that with a character like death?
Well, the way I plan a book is by essentially writing chapter headings over and over again, and that's how I structure things. And it's almost mathematical in a way. But then what happens is, like, that's a 10-part book, and something you think, a chapter that's going to appear in part 4 ends up being shifted all the way back to part 7.
Right.
Because the story grows around you no matter how well you plan it.
That's true. I want to ask you some questions that I ask all authors when they're here. These are rapid fire. Get ready. And there is a trapdoor in the floor if you don't like these answers. Favorite children's book?
It's got to be Green Eggs and Ham.
Why?
I love the cheerfulness of Sam I Am, and just that he's called Sam I Am. You know, I do not like them Sam I Am.
Now, you had multiple editions of Dr. Seuss in your house, in different languages.
Well, yeah, in German as well, and it's all been sort of appropriated and changed, and you wonder how you get the rhyme and the silliness through that, and also. So yeah, we had those books as kids. We had large volume.
Why did you have multiple versions in languages?
My mum and dad were really conscious of the fact that they couldn't speak English when they came to Australia. So they wanted their kids to be really good readers. And
I see.
without really pushing it on us, but when I was 4, I used to eat Dr. Seuss books. I'd just chew on the corner. You know,
I still chew on those. They're
quite a good
very
diet.
tasty. Yeah, they're very good. What is your least favorite book? Doesn't have to be a children's book.
Well, I can say that it's The Book Thief, and it's the book I'm working on now, because you go through writing a book and you just can't stand the sight of it, and everything in it is terrible. And you've read it, that and every full stop is like a giant rock you've got to climb over. And so you know what writing's like. You're sitting there half the time going, "Geez, I'm worthless."
You do feel
you know,
that,
I'm pathetic. You know, and I'm lazy.
Until the audience embraces it, and then you say, I was brilliant. It was perfect, right?
Well,
I mean, there's a day of that, and then you're back to, I'm miserable. This is never working.
That's right. Oh, well, you get a review that picks up one. It says 10 beautiful things about the book, and one little thing
to the heart.
Yeah, that criticises it, and that's what you'll remember.
Yeah.
But they found that one little thing that you might have been unsure about yourself.
Before I go back to our rapid fire questions, what did you learn about yourself? Because I find in the writing, you do learn about things in your memory, perceptions you had that you perhaps didn't even realize, and they work their way out in the writing. What did you discover in The Book Thief about yourself, about you?
I think just how much stories mean to me. And I think I'd learned that stories essentially are what we're made of. And I mean, there's DNA and there's physicalities and things like that, but if you take stories away from us, we don't actually have anything.
What was the story that helped you find your way in life, your path? And what lessons did it leave you with?
In this case, I'd probably have to go for S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders when I was 14, and it made me want to be a writer. And some of her other books did too. The difference was she was 16 and wrote a book. I was 16 and wrote 8 pages that could be entered into a competition for the worst book ever written. But you grow, and then you try again, and then you write a book that doesn't get published. And then you write your next book, which you don't send off because you know it was too much like the first one. And finally, you know, you may get there, but you start writing thinking that you may never get published, but you do it anyway.
Where do you write and why?
I write in my office at home or my room, but it's always open. My kids come in. I've got an old typewriter on this thing, and they just come in and bash away
at the keys.
I like a bit of chaos as well, until I yell at them and tell them to get out.
And slam and lock the door.
That's enough. And I also like to write I like to edit in the kitchen, and I like to feel like it's near me. You want to wake up in the morning and feel like the story's close to you.
Where do your best ideas come from?
Where? They come from working. They come from sitting down at the desk, and that's where you're working on part 7 or chapter 3, and you'll get an idea for that first chapter that you just couldn't crack when you were there, and then you go back and fix it. Where I don't get my best ideas is walking along the beach.
No.
That's when you worry about your taxes and everything. You know, you actually, it's like if someone said to you, how do I become a better runner? You don't say, go for a walk on the beach and think about running.
But part of it is
run.
scavenging, though, isn't it, Markus? I mean, part of it is observing, seeing the quirks, or hearing that little lilt in the voice and wanting to capture that. I mean, that observation is important, isn't it?
It is. I mean, and it's the collection of all those things through your life, and that's how most people's first books are essentially kind of their life.
Yeah, or refashioned in some way. If you could appoint a writing mentor, dead or alive, who would it be?
I tell you what, it wouldn't. Well, he was a writer as well, but I wouldn't mind Michelangelo as a mentor.
Oh.
Although he'd be pretty strict.
Yeah. And a little quirky around the edges if those biographies are to be believed.
That's true,
Yeah,
but I tell you what, I mean, there'd be a work ethic.
Yeah, that's true. There was a great, I mean, he was amazing. Look what he did.
Not to mention genius. I'd have to take that back. I think I'd feel too worthless all the time.
What advice would you give parents trying to get their kids to read? What's the best advice that you've used in your own family?
Well, the first thing I would say is start before reading, and don't be afraid to tell your kids the same stories twice or 3 times or 4 times, because that's how they learn them and that's how they love them. And so first for me, it's the love of story as opposed to even a love of books. The other is to be seen reading yourself. And I remember even when I used to go to high schools, and I still go to high schools sometimes, and they used to say to the PE teacher, can you just, that the English department would say, oh, can you just carry that book as you walk through the playground, so that the kids just see you
with the book. Yeah.
And there's no point, and I often tutored kids, and every now and again there'd be parents who'd tell their kids to read, but then they'd buy them a PlayStation.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with having a PlayStation or whatever it is, but you know, it's good to have the books around the house. For us, it was always visible, and so you're showing your kids that.
I think you've
important.
hit it. That love of story. We all love stories. In our souls, we love and yearn for stories.
Yeah.
And I think if you hook them into a story or a character that they're attracted to, there's no stopping them.
Kids are voracious when it comes to that, and what I've noticed as well, like speaking in schools, like, and you get, and in public appearances and things like that, you've told the story that many times, you start to feel guilty, and then there'll be some kid or someone who puts their hand up, and in my case, I'd always had this story about getting revenge on my brother. It's a whole story about eggs and things like that, and someone will ask, can you tell that story? And I think, aren't you sick of that story? But we love to, that's why, you know, we love to watch the same movies over and over again when we really love them.
Well, I would argue parents were asking me at a recent school visit, well, my son, he all he wants to do is sit there and play his Xbox all day. And he keeps going back to it. I said, sit with him, as I did with my teenager, sit with him for a little bit and find out why. These are well-made stories in many cases. The gaming, you almost do the game to get to the next cliffhanger or the solution. Somehow we've got to work that into books to get them on that same conveyor belt with that same hunger.
Yeah, I often look at it, and I've often explained it as books are just tougher.
Yeah,
you know, people think, oh, books, you know, that idea of, you know, especially for boys, because when you're a young male writer, as I was once, you know.
You've got another month and a half. You're okay, Markus.
5 minutes maybe.
That's right. We'll time you out.
Yeah, but I used to say that, you know, it's all good and well to point out education and things like that as, you know, up against sport is not necessarily masculine things to do, but reading's a tougher thing to do because you've got to do some work. You've got to do a bit of work to get into it, and it's there to test you a little bit, but the rewards are greater.
I agree.
And, you know, a loved book, when you really love a book, it really can mean the world to you, and it can change your life more readily than anything else.
I agree. No, it's a friend. It's a passport to the world, to a world you may never visit or know.
And that old adage from To Kill a Mockingbird that you don't know someone until you've walked around in their skin, and the idea of empathy there is so important.
No, books teach us so much. Final question. There are two classifications of writer. There are gardeners and there are architects. Which are you, a gardener or an architect as a writer?
I'd probably have to go for architect.
Really?
Well, because
you outline?
Yeah, I like to build, and I like to have a structure that I'm inside of that I can't. I've got to have a very good reason to step out of, and in a way, that constriction is freeing because you feel safe.
I agree.
And then you can, you know, so that's why you can count the chapters in The Book Thief, and there are 8 chapters in each of the 10 parts, and it's all worked out in that particular way.
No, there's a safety in that. And then, as you were saying earlier, once you're cozy and safe in this structure, you can maneuver and let the story tell itself.
Yeah, that's right. You know, and if you have to build another house, you do that.
Yeah, you build another house. I'm glad you built the one you built. Looking forward to reading The Bridge of Clay. Where is that now?
Oh, it's.
You've been working on this book for a long time.
Yeah,
Markus.
it'll come out sometime this century, I hope. It's been a rough ride, but I think that's there to test you as well. I think writing is always a measure. It's always asking you, how much do you want it? You know, right down to when you were unpublished. You know, you just got to keep getting up all the time.
No, it never gets easier, really. You're still fighting the words at every turn. They don't know that. They just go on the fun ride. But we sit there anguishing and bleeding over those pages.
Of course, but, you know, like, it's often said, if everyone, you know, if it was easy, everyone would do it.
I agree. Well, I'm glad you did it. Thank you, Markus.
Thank you. No, it's such a pleasure.
The special anniversary edition of The Book Thief by Markus Zusak is available now at bookstores everywhere and online. And be sure to follow our literacy program, Storyented. Tell us which stories changed your life. We're at storyented.com, And if you impress us, we might send you a signed edition from one of our featured authors. And as we always say, find your story, find your way.